Okay, welcome everyone. Hello. Thank you all so much for coming out here tonight. My name is Amali and I'm the events coordinator here at Books on Magic. Before we get started, I just have a few logistics to point out for how tonight's going to go. First off, we do ask that you keep your mask on at all times while at this event. We will be doing a hand-raised audience Q&A towards the end of the event, so start thinking of questions to ask now. After the talk, Jody will be signing and personalizing books at the desk near the side door where you're checked in. We also have a few additional books available to purchase. And if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we'd love to encourage you to buy a copy of Two Wheels Good online using the link in the live stream description. All right, so with all that in mind, we're very excited to introduce Jody, Rosen, and Dana Stevens, who are here celebrating the release of Jody's debut book, Two Wheels Good, The History and Mystery of the Bicycle. In Two Wheels Good, Jody deconstructs the bicycle, a commonplace object that most people nowadays don't really think twice about. However, Jody shows us that the bicycle is so much more than two wheels, a seat, and a handlebar. It is the most used form of transportation. It is a frequently overlooked yet huge component of the global economy. It is a symbol of resistance, anti-authoritarianism, feminism. It's even a sex toy if you want it to be. Needless to say, we all can't wait to hear what more Jody has to say about this book, about his extensive research, and of course, about the bicycle. Jody Rosen is a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine. His work has appeared in Slate, New York, The New Yorker, and many other publications. He lives in Brooklyn with his family. And as I mentioned before, Dana Stevens joins Jody in conversation tonight. Dana is one of the country's best-known film critics and culture podcasters with a loyal social media following. She is the head film critic at Slate and a co-host of two Slate podcasts, The Culture Gabfest and The Spoiler Special. She has written for the New York Times Magazine, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, Book Forum, and Aperture Magazine. She lives in New York City with her family and can be found on Twitter and Instagram at The High Sign. Cameraman is her first book, and we have 2 copies available tonight, so act fast. Anyway, without any further delay, please join me in welcoming Jody and Dana.
Such a precarious setup, it's crazy. So, yeah. So there's a lot to unpack there. I love the fact that this is now my debut book, because some of you know that I actually wrote another book, but I've tried to bury that book. I've tried to erase that from history, and now I'm going to take that as evidence that it's kind of worked. So this is my debut book. It's about bicycles. I'm really, really pleased to be here. Thank you for coming out, everyone. This is so funny because I know everyone in this room. My wife, Lauren, and I'm saying this for the people at home on the YouTube stream, but Lauren and I have talked about having some kind of quasi post-pandemic brunch kind of thing, whatever phase of the pandemic we're in, having a brunch, and literally everyone here are the people who would be on the guest list. So we just need some bagels and lox. We will have done it. Thank you, Books of Magic. We've all, or at least I've, dropped a lot of cash in here, so really it's the least you could do as host of this event. And thank you, Dana, for joining me. Dana is the author of Cameraman, which is a great book if you haven't read it, and is great in every way. And also she officiated my wedding. Some of you know that. So she does it all. She does book events, weddings, maybe purses. I don't know. Okay, so here's the thing. I don't like readings in general. I don't like reading from a text that is not meant to be read aloud. And some people are very good at that. They're professionals. I'm not one of those. In fact, I was a few weeks back. I was supposed to record the audiobook of this book, and I tried for about 90 minutes. It was supposed to be like a week-long engagement, and I had to fire myself after 90 minutes. And the Random House audio producer who was there, kind of overseeing this, agreed with the decision. So for that reason, like I decided like the thing to do is to bombard you with images and try and like use the images to get over the awkwardness of reading from what the text I put together, which is basically culled from my book. So it's going to sound a little more writerly than is optimal, but you're going to love it. So. The bicycle hides in plain sight. For 2 centuries, the bicycle has been a prime mover in history, shaping culture, politics, and individual lives in profound ways, yet bicycles are easily overlooked, as we were just hearing. This is odd because, in fact, bicycles are hard to miss. There are so many of them. There are probably 2 billion bicycles in the world. That's the best estimate we have. There are approximately 1 billion cars. Our cities and towns, our built environment, our economies, our laws are organized around automobiles. We hop between continents on airplanes, yet across the world, more people travel by bicycle than by any form of other form of transportation. The continuing relevance of the bicycle challenges our convictions about the way that history unfolds and the way progress works. The modern bicycle, this thing, the so-called safety bicycle, with the machine we're all familiar with 2 wheels of equal size and a diamond-shaped frame you see there in the middle, was invented in the mid-1880s, and understandably many people regard it as a relic of that period, as a piece of Victoriana. The materials that are used to build a bike, like steel and vulcanized rubber, are things we associate with the industrial age. And the same is true of the pedals and cranks and chains, the technologies that are deployed when we operate the bike. And of course, there's the human muscle that makes the bike go, the ultimate low-tech power source. A bike, you could say, is a definitively analog machine, a thing that's out of place and out of pace with the accelerated tempos of our age, of the digital age. Even some of the most zealous cyclists regard bikes as anachronisms, as slow. This was a bike shop that used to be right up here, I think on Bergen. No. I think it was more like Douglas or something like that. Maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, but anyway, regarded as slow, as old-fashioned, as quaint. This is the Tweed Run event where people dress up in Victorian costumes and bike around. But the bicycle was never quaint. From the beginning, with the invention of the first proto-bicycle, this thing that we're looking at, the Laufmaschine, or running machine, also known as the Velocipede, which arrived in the world in the German Duchy of Baden in 1817. From the beginning, the bicycle was transformative, controversial. It's been a flashpoint in culture wars, an instigator of moral panics. The arguments that surround bikes aren't just restricted to predictable debates about safe streets and urban transit and the future of cities, but take in larger questions of class, race, gender, sex, morality, public health, and these days, the very future of life on Earth. In short, for 200 years, the bicycle has been both reviled and revered, often in very bombastic and even messianic terms. So in this book, I chronicle that 2-century-long story of bicycle love and bicycle loathing, and I also write about what I guess you could call, if you want to be pretentious about it, the mythos of the bike, the philosophical ideas about bikes that have circulated through the decades. And hopefully without getting too esoteric myself, I say a thing or two about the sensual and spiritual dimensions of bike riding, the truly strange experience of traveling by a vehicle where you're both the passenger and the engine. So I'm going to kind of whiz through a bunch of photos and talk about some of the ideas that I get into in the book. This is the book. there's a chapter in the book called The Bicycle Window, which is a kind of survey of a few of the it's about bicycle creation myths, about the various tall tales about where and when and by whom the bicycle was invented that have been propagated through the years. We know the facts of the matter here. The first bicycle, the earliest bicycle, is this thing that I talked about earlier, the Laufmaschine, or the Velocipede. It was the creation of a minor German nobleman, a guy named Karl von Drais, who unveiled this invention, as I said, in the year 1817. Yet, alternative histories have continued to proliferate. Legends about ancient Chinese bikes, the so-called Happy Dragon, fantasies about Roman cavalries who were mounted on bicycles, bicycling medieval knights, and there are scraps and curiosities that have been cited as evidence of long lost, first long lost bikes. This here is the bicycle window. It's a stained glass image, which is located in the tiny church of St. Giles in the village of Stoke Poges, west of London. I went to this place. It's amazing, and various people have claimed that what this is depicting is a bike that dated from sometime in the early Middle Ages that was somehow lost to history. Then there's the case of Leonardo's bicycle, a sketch of a suspiciously modern-looking bike discovered in 1974 in the papers of Leonardo da Vinci, which was quickly debunked as a hoax, but not before it made international headlines. If we look closer at this New York Times article, there's this remarkable assertion here. Bicycles appear in the bas-reliefs of ancient Babylon, Egypt, and Pompeii. This is a total fiction. I have no idea how this got in. Actually, I do have some idea how this got in the Times. I've written for the Times. But anyway, this revised the birth date of the bicycle by millennia. No truth to it whatsoever. But I think there's some reasons for all this. On the one hand, the impulse to backdate the arrival of the bike reflects what historians call priority claims, an ongoing competition between nations for bragging rights. Various countries have claimed that the bicycle was invented in Italy, in China, in France, what have you. And I also think it speaks to the fact that as a historical phenomenon, the bike arrived illogically late. The technology that was necessary to build a bike was available since the Middle Ages, but the thing itself arrived a full decade and a half after the invention of the steam locomotive. In fact, that safety bicycle we saw earlier, which was the first truly modern bike that worked really well, was the first version of that became a kind of a best-selling, mass-marketed bike. Appeared in 1885, and that was the same year that Carl Benz unveiled his first Motorwagen. So the automotive age was dawning at the same time when we finally got the bicycle. So the chronology is a little weird. And then of course there's just the design of this thing, which is beautiful, right? It has a beauty, a logic, and a simplicity that feels timeless. It seems like the bike has always existed, or should have always existed, or at least is something that has ancient origins, like a thing that is more likely to have been unearthed by an archaeologist than dreamed up by a German bureaucrat in the second decade of the 19th century. I'm going to take a swig of water here because it's getting a little dicey. Okay, I want to just again kind of go through a few topics that are in this book, and I might skip around because I want to get to questions with Dana. So there's a section in the bicycle about in the book about the very first bicycle craze, which took place around 1819 in Regency, England. This was the Velocipede, which was kind of a big trendy item among the elites, the wealthy dandies of London, and was also an object of resentment among the population at large. It's an episode which in various ways anticipated the class politics which, for instance, swirl around the bicycle today here in New York. These guys were maybe like the proto-bicycle hipsters, or the kind of bourgeois bohemians who people scorn for riding their fancy bikes around bike lanes. There's a chapter in the book about the relationship between the bicycle and the horse, which in 19th century America took the form of a battle that played out in streets and occasionally on racetracks. Here again, the later history is prefigured. The arguments about progress and obsolescence and the road rage that erupted between cyclists and drivers of for instance, horse-drawn carriages are reminiscent of the disputes we see today between bike riders and motorists. There's a chapter in the book about the bicycle as a flying machine and a spacecraft. You see it says Voyage à la Lune here. This thing is from, I think, around 1868 in Paris. What's being depicted is a guy on some sort of flying bike cruising out of town above Paris. This idea of a flying bike or a space bike has a long lineage in pop culture, from vaudeville and circus acts to turn of the century advertising art, these wonderful old posters, to E.T. To science fiction writing that gives voice to very 21st century concerns about politics and identity. On the one hand, the connection we make between cycling and flying is metaphorical. It's an expression of the feelings of freedom and exhilaration we experience when we ride bikes. But in fact, these dreams of flight on a bike were not so very far from reality. The many attempts by 19th century inventors to create bicycle airships, like the ones pictured here, never got off the ground. But on December 17, 1903, the Wright Flyer took off over Kill Devil Hills in Kitty Hawks, North Carolina. The Wright brothers were bicycle mechanics and manufacturers who applied lessons on balance, stability, and flexibility that they had learned from bikes to design their plane. And they built the plane, using tools and components straight out of their bicycle shop. The Wright brothers kind of realized that in the way that you balance a bike, use your body weight to balance a bike, that same principle can be applied to an airplane. So a cyclist was kind of a proto-pilot. So the aviation age was in many ways an extension and a result of the cycling boom. And the same could be said of the automotive age. The genetic links between bicycles and cars are closer than most people know. For instance, what we're looking at here is Henry Ford's first automobile, the quadricycle. You can see, as the name suggests, it was a four-wheeled kind of cousin of the bike. It has these bike-looking tires. It had an ethanol-powered engine, a two-cylinder engine, but it also, if you look closely there, had a chain that drove the rear wheels like a bicycle. Parts essential to the development of cars, from ball bearings to brake pads, were first developed for bicycles. And other cornerstones of the automotive industry, the assembly line, dealer networks, planned obsolescence, were also pioneered by bicycle moguls, many of whom transitioned from bikes to the car trade. And then there are the roads themselves, which in the United States are a legacy of the so-called Good Roads movement, a turn-of-the-century political crusade led by cyclists, a super consequential political movement that's almost totally forgotten these days. But the interstate highway system, suburban sprawl, strip malls, the credit and the blame for these features of the American landscape is usually given to car culture, but their origins can be traced to the vision of coast-to-coast macadamization, paving the roads, paving the land, which was first advocated in the 1890s by the then powerful bicycle bloc. In the 1896 presidential election, the candidates competed to win the votes of the League of American Wheelmen, which was the big advocacy organization, and secure the votes of the nation's cyclists. And how far we have come. Doesn't work like that these days. But in any case, what we have here is bike activism like literally paved the way for the automobile. And this history, of course, flies in the face of the received wisdom, which casts bicycles as kind of the antithesis of the automobile. The phrase "two wheels good" that I use in my title comes from this bike activist slogan, "two wheels good, four wheels bad," which is like a paraphrase of Orwell's famous quip from animal farm. But the motto, I think, smacks of sanctimony, the certainty that bikes are morally superior to cars and that cyclists are nobler than motorists. This idea that the bicycle is inherently good and virtuous is entrenched in bicycle culture and in the historiography of the bike. Traditional histories have emphasized the role of bicycles as a liberating force and portrayed cyclists as kind of heroic underdogs. It's a very romantic idea of the bicycle, as something that's insurgent and punk and an enemy not just of car culture but of everything that's rotten, corporatism, conservatism, etc. It's true, of course, that bicycles have been tools of protest and resistance, playing pivotal roles in such movements as we see here, the suffragist struggle for in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Of course, the Tiananmen Square uprising was in many ways a bicycle protest. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of people pilgrimaged to Tiananmen Square daily on bikes. But the politics of the bicycle are complex and the facts don't always align with the pieties. Recently, scholars have begun unearthing a less sentimental history. In many places, scholars have told us the bicycle first appeared carrying soldiers, settlers, prospectors, proselytizers, and other seekers of territory, treasure, and souls. Here are some of these people. The raw materials that are used to build bikes have been acquired at a cost to the environment and to human beings, in some cases through systematic violence against indigenous populations in colonial states. So that the high-minded story that's passed down in the standard histories, the idea that what we have here is this peaceable green machine that people ride and they find kind of freedom and fulfillment riding the bike, can be counterposed with these other scenes from the age of empire. Infantrymen, gendarmes, tax collectors, all these colonial officials and missionaries and explorers who rode the bike in colonies in places like British Malaya, German Togoland, French Algeria, the Philippines, the Australian outback, where they barnstormed on bicycles to the gold mines, etc., on indigenous land. This is a photograph of missionaries in the Congo around 1920. Decades earlier, in what was then Belgian King Leopold II's Congo Free State, millions of Congolese people died harvesting rubber, a genocidal system of forced labor instituted when the rubber market boomed during the great bicycle craze of the 1890s. So this incredible humanitarian and ecological infamy is directly traceable to the big bicycle boom of the period. Now, these complexities aren't just artifacts of the past. In the pandemic summer of 2020, Black Lives Matter demonstrators poured into the streets of American cities, many of them on bikes. They were met there by another group of cyclists, heavily armored bicycle cops, who deployed violent crowd control tactics and weaponized the bicycle itself, using bikes as riot shields and even as bludgeons. So, perhaps the bicycle is the noblest machine there is, but the nobility isn't inherent. The politics of the bike are always up for grabs. And this is kind of, these complications are things I tried to bear in mind when I was writing this book. And I kind of did my best to write against the grain of, not exactly the bicycle literature, because there's a lot of great bicycle literature out there that I drew on, especially the kind of newer scholarly literature about the bike, but the kind of discourse that in activist circles is not only sentimental and idealizing of the bicycle, but is very, very Eurocentric and American-centric. It kind of focuses on the cities of the West. Places like Amsterdam and Copenhagen are discussed as like the great, the cycling paradises. But what's ignored is virtually every other place on Earth that's not a white Western European place. And the irony is that that's where most of the bicycles are. By far, the greater number of bicycles and cyclists are on the farms and in the villages and in the megacities of the global south in Asia and Africa and Latin America. And if we shift our focus to the developing world, a very different kind of bicycle culture snaps into focus. One in which cycling is not a lifestyle choice, but a livelihood. So these are astonishing images, these things blow my mind, of bicycles and tricycles loaded with goods. They're testaments to the central role that pedal power plays in the economies of these places in cities like, come on in, Agger.
I'm sorry, Jody.
Sorry, no, that's my Agger, everybody. He's a good friend. And an editor of a really fancy magazine. Yeah, so I was talking about these cities of the global south where there's all these cargo bikes. According to one recent study, there are between 40 and 60 million working cargo cycles in China alone, which is just, that's a mind blower. That's a figure that exceeds by many times the combined worldwide tally of all other freight vehicles. So if you add up all the trucks and trains and ships and airplanes, you come up with a number that's many tens of millions less than the number of working cargo cycles in China. The sheer number of these bikes and their prominence in these countries with large export markets, places like China and India and Bangladesh, suggests that the humble bicycle is playing a far more integral role in the mechanics of global trade than most people know. And there's another kind of cargo cycle, the kind that hauls human cargo, the cycle rickshaw. And for the book, I traveled to Dhaka, Bangladesh, which is the world's fastest growing and most densely populated megacity, a really amazing place. And I'm going to go back. But yeah, I wrote a chapter where I was kind of reporting on the lives of the rickshaw pullers, who are called rickshaw wallahs over there. And this was a really eye-opening experience for like a provincial, like white Brooklynite dude. And among other things, it really raised my consciousness about like the cycling culture that's here, that's invisible to a lot of people, including to me for years. We're looking here at an image of one of the deliveristas, the food delivery cyclists. You know, these food app delivery cyclists who recently have organized it here after being really suffering from terrible labor practices and suffering during the pandemic. They were essential workers who were out in the middle of the pandemic delivering food to New Yorkers who needed it, keeping restaurants afloat, but they were treated very, very badly. Don't really have time to go into all the details, but the point being is we have our own underclass of working cargo cyclists right here in the West and right here in New York City. And it took a trip to South Asia for me to kind of see those people and start to really take the measure of how complicated our own bike culture is here at home. Okay, so that's a lot. I gotta get into conversation with Dana, but I'm gonna do one other thing because it's gotten a little bit dark, and I want to actually break my own rule and read one quick passage from the book, because this book is like, there's a lot of weird stuff in the book because bicycles are really actually kind of weird, especially if you spend a lot of time looking at them. The longer you look, the odder they get. I want to read a passage that kind of captures some of that weirdness. It's from a chapter called Graveyards, which is about what happens when bicycles die, two bicycles when they die. It's about people chucking bikes into canals and rivers and other bodies of water. This is actually a global phenomenon. This is an image of a bicycle that was thrown into the Canal Saint-Martin in Paris. They drain the Canal Saint-Martin every 8 years or so. And when they do it, like the skeletal forms of all these bicycles emerge, because it's, besides cell phones and bottles of wine, it's like the thing that's most often chucked into the water. But the chapter's about that, and it's about people ditching bikes on street corners and leaving them to rust and rot. And the chapter is also about the recycling and waste and these old dead bicycles and the ways they get reborn. So I think it's a pretty good example of what happens when you spend too long writing a book about bikes and you get into like a weird, trippy, like bicycle-obsessed headspace. Just this passage begins with a reference to a scrap metal facility that's actually on this street, at the very end of Court Street, right near Hamilton Avenue, like on the banks of the Gowanus Canal. It's a place where you can often see these big, huge grapple excavators. Some of the people here who live in my building know this place real well. You can see the grapple excavators dumping scrap into barges in the canal. And if you look closely, you can see a lot of bikes and bike parts going into those big barges. So here goes. This is one paragraph from my book. Some derelict bikes get a second life. The scrapyard down the street from my home ships its metal bales off to recycling facilities. There, the scrap is cleaned and sorted, placed in furnaces and heated to a molten state, and submitted to purification processes. Eventually, the metals are cast or rolled into sheets and put back into circulation. Steel and aluminum are among the most widely recycled materials on Earth. Sometimes, a scrapped bicycle frame may be reborn as a beverage can, or as a food packaging, or as food packaging of another sort. Recycled steel and aluminum are also used in the building of airplanes and automobiles, and indeed, bicycles. They are used in the construction of street furniture and houses and apartment buildings. The mystic in me likes to imagine a cityscape formed from old bicycles. Cyclists riding bikes reincarnated from earlier bikes, pedaling past skyscrapers supported by girders and beams and rebar made of recycled bike frames, while jet planes patched together from scrap bicycles soar overhead. Metal recycling produces environmentally damaging waste, but some byproducts can be recycled and put to use. The dross or slag that results from aluminum casting is sometimes utilized as filler in asphalt and concrete mixtures. In certain places, therefore, the road itself is a kind of bicycle graveyard, and cyclists out for Sunday rides are rolling their wheels across a landscape of reconstituted bones. Thanks. Hey, Dan.
Hey, all right, that's great. Since you covered the bikes in the slideshow, I can get into the book. Yeah, in fact, your last little bit of reading there leads perfectly into the first question I wanted to ask you, which is you talked about the title just now and the provenance and the meaning of the title, Two Wheels Good, and that it comes from this Animal Farm reference that then became a bike slogan. But let's talk for a minute about the subtitle, which I love, The History and Mystery of the Bicycle. I love the cleanness and simplicity and the rhyme, and just how much that subtitle covers. Once you've read the book, you really see that, is that this balance between history and mystery is really, I think, the tension of the book, that it's, you know, a nonfiction book that's researched and highly reported and full of facts that you gathered on your travels, but it also, as we just heard, is this kind of mystical reflection on the mental illness that descends upon you when you think about bicycles too much. So I guess I wanted to talk about that a bit, like what genre you see this book being in, and I know it's something you struggled with, and I did with my book as well. I was writing it asking, like, what is this? It's nonfiction, but what manner of nonfiction is it? It's sort of the history of an idea, but it's also the history of an object. But I would not say your book is a material history in the way of those books like Salt, you know, those books that would be about one thing. It's not bike, you know,
Right.
because you don't chronologically march through bike history and talk about it only as a kind of commodity or economic fixture, you know. So talk about the history and the mystery and how you wrote your way through that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it was like part of what I was trying to do. First of all, the subtitle was a you know, this is how the sausage gets made. But I had many different subtitles, and that subtitle was a compromise, but it's one that I wound up liking. And now I think, oh, you know what? Maybe editors know a thing or two because it's better than the ones I had in mind. But yeah, I think I was trying to what I was trying to do throughout this. I read a lot of books about bike history, and I love that history, but I was really conscious of not trying to repeat, to the extent possible, not trying to repeat the earlier stuff and to kind of stumble into potted history. You know what I mean? Because there's many off-told tales about bikes, and avoiding that was was really important to me. So I thought, okay, first of all, I don't want to do just a straightforward history. I don't have the chops for that anyway. You know, I'm not really a historian. I'm kind of like a lay, fake historian. And I wanted to be able to like write a book whose different chapters had different moods and vibes. You know, so yeah, there's some chapters that are history, like more straightforward history. And I, you know, when I wrote those chapters, I tried to do that stuff almost exclusively working with, you know, primary sources to like do original research. But I wanted it to be, you know, the book to be a little weirder, a little more, maybe more fun, and you know, to be able to like kind of unleash my deep thoughts, my musings about the bicycle. So that's where the mystery comes in for me, because I just like, yeah, the kind of, I mean, what I spent like way too much time thinking about is like what a bike means, and I thought about that. I thought about that well before I was under contract to write a bike book. Like whenever I was on, I mean, this sounds corny, but like, you know, like I like just about the most fun thing I do in my life is ride a bike around, and it's such an intensely pleasurable and also kind of weird and uncanny experience that I've always been like, why is this so great? What does it mean that I'm on this machine and I'm operating on it? I'm operating it and I'm riding it and I'm kind of a part of it. It's sort of like as much a prosthesis as it is a vehicle. It's just like an extension of my body. So all that stuff to me is deeply mysterious. It's like a you know, it's a puzzle that I have not and will not solve, but this was like my best shot at it.
Right, well, and that weaves in with the mystery part does, because I think part of the reason the bike, as you've already about, has been so idealized and romanticized and argued about, you know, throughout its history is because of the strong physical sensations associated with it. In relation to that, and I thought you weren't going to read, so I was going to read for you. I wanted to read just a little bit of the part of this book that had me at hello, pretty much, and it's from the prologue, so it's on page XB1 before the book itself gets started. But this is maybe the moment that the mystery first comes in, because you've just told some history. You just finished talking about John Dunlop, who invented the pneumatic tire, right, which is a big advancement that makes modern bikes possible. And after you tell the story of him and his son, and there's a really sweet story of his young son, 9 years old, trying out the pneumatic tires for the first time and going on a crazy night ride, you suddenly go into this little mystical reverie, and I just wanted to read this bit. The connection we make between cycling and flying is metaphorical. You might even call it spiritual, an expression of the powerful feelings of freedom and exhilaration we experience when we ride bikes. But it's also a response to a physical fact. If cyclists imagine themselves to be flying, it is because, in a sense, they are. When you ride a bicycle, you're airborne. The wheels that spin beneath you slip a continuous band of compressed air between the bike and the road, holding you aloft. That floating feeling, that sensation of airy buoyancy, is heightened by the way the bike bears your body. Your legs do the work of propelling the vehicle, but the job of supporting your body weight is outsourced to the bicycle itself. I could go on, because then you get into E.T., you know, the scene of the kids flying over the moon. But that image, which comes very early in the book of cycling as flying, seems like it's a huge motif that keeps reemerging, both in history, you know, as you see with the French illustrations of people biking to the moon, but also in your own personal stories of riding a bike.
Yeah, no, that's right. Actually, like this is like the other subtitle I had in mind was something a little sci-fi, and in fact, at one point I mocked up, or actually my wife mocked up, like my idea for a cover, which was like literally a bicycle on the moon, because this cover turned out great. But in any case, that was my initial idea, and like it's because like that, you know, that was such like a guiding image for me in this book, and kind of a leitmotif which I like returned to maybe even the strange shows a few times, because the number of times that I come back to bikes in space, it like recurs in several chapters.
Right.
There's like for instance, there's a chapter about stationary bikes, and these odd bikes that go nowhere, and they don't move, and one of them is this thing called the Cevis, which is a bike that's on the International Space Station. So the astronauts, when they're up there, you know, for 6 months at a time, they never like actually use their legs. They don't use their legs to support their body weight. So the muscles atrophy, and you know, it can have bad health outcomes. So the astronauts have to have this exercise regimen in order to make sure that when they get back to terra firma, they're going to be able to stand and walk and their legs will work. So they ride this kind of floating stationary bike. And it really is, it's awesome, because like you can go on YouTube and see images of this, and it really is like they're riding a floating unicycle. It's cool, but anyway, that's a bicycle that goes nowhere, which is literally in space, but at NASA they like to joke that it's actually also the fastest bicycle of all time, because if a cyclist is on there for like a 45-minute workout, like he completes like 2 circumnavigations of like the planet, right? And but there's so many things like that have come up. You know, even that very first bike, that German Laufmaschine from 1817. Well, you know, right away, people like the poets who were singing that bicycle were talking about it, comparing it to Pegasus, you know, the flying stallion from mythology. So this idea about a bicycle as a flying machine is just like, it's just always there. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Well, and it actually ties into the next one, which is maybe taking the same image of, you know, the idealized flying bicycle into a more political space, which is this recurring idea of cycling as a form of utopia, or like cycling communities as utopian cultures, which seems like it's been with bikes since the beginning. And you trace a bunch of those. I mean, these are not in chronological order at all, but you know, things like Critical Mass, the San Francisco-based protest movement that started in the 90s, or a generation earlier on a gentler scale, the Bike Centennial, which you have a really charming chapter about, 1976, or in other countries, you know, the Tiananmen Square protest you were talking about, or there's a whole chapter, wonderful chapter on Bhutan and how the political economy of Bhutan, bikes are very important to their sort of idea of national happiness, right? And that the king is or the former king is a big bike enthusiast. So it just seems like part of your project is to trace the rise and the fall of these different cycling utopias through history, and to, in some ways, you know, de-idealize them. But the title of the book is also Two Wheels Good. You know, I feel like there is a part of me that's also drawn to the cycling utopia. So is that a question? I don't know. I guess I'm just asking you to talk about utopia.
Okay, I'll try my best to talk about utopia. Yeah, no, I mean, like, I think, you know, in the last chapter I talk it's called Mass Movement, and it's about these protest movements, including the Tiananmen Square uprising, but it's also about how China, before kind of Tiananmen Square and in the years immediately after, was this kind of cycling paradise, because China was, you know, it was called the kingdom of the bicycle. There, at the height of China's, you know, bicycle culture, there were something like 300 million bicycles on China's roads, which is an insane number. You know, part of the reason that the Tiananmen Square protests were bicycle protests was just because that's how everyone got around in Beijing. There were 9 million bicycles in Beijing at that point. And what's happened in China is, you know, they've embraced car culture, along with embracing the kind of, you know, what they call market socialism. So the new China, the new, you know, capitalist, quasi-capitalist, quasi-communist, whatever you want to call it, China, really embraced the automobile and rejected and marginalized the car, like literally marginalized it, like embraced the car and marginalized the bike. So got rid of bike lanes, spaces for bikes, and stigmatized bicycles, kind of in various ways. So in China you had this kind of like organic bicycle utopia, and it feels like what a lot of cycling activists are trying to do in the West is kind of is through legislation and you know, new infrastructure, bike sharing programs, is try and create a culture like the one that existed organically in China for decades after decades. At the same time, you have China, who kind of had that there and just chucked it away. But that's definitely it's definitely a theme, I think, in the book, and certainly in bicycle history, which is that there's like, you know, there's always like these booms and busts with the bicycle. there's these utopias which seem to arise and then vanish. And but somehow the bicycle always comes back. You know, I talked in that little thing I read about the fact that the bicycle has, you know, even, but when it first arrived, it was already an anachronism. It's kind of like just out of time, right? Logically, we shouldn't, you know, it makes more sense to ride around in a vehicle that can go 60, 70 miles an hour and keeps you dry in the rain and stuff like that. So in that sense, like, the bicycle should be obsolete, but for various reasons, it's not going, it isn't, and it won't be, and always seems to return. And I think there's this, yeah, so that theme of a utopia and the kind of longing for a bicycle paradise is definitely something that animates activists for sure. And as I say, there's a lot of very high-flown romantic rhetoric around it among cycling activists, but it's understandable, I guess, to everyone like this. By the way, Dana, I don't know if your dress can everyone see the dress?
I've been waiting for years. And a small detail, I also have a boat necklace, so. All right, Utopia, I asked that one. Okay, I guess this is a process question, which you said people like to hear about from authors, but this is honestly just, as a fellow author, I'm interested in this, which is the traveling and reporting for this story, right? You went to, as you mentioned in your slideshow, you went to Stokes Poge village to look at the bicycle window in England. You went to Bhutan, you went to Dhaka in Bangladesh. I don't know if you went to Wuhan in China, you write about that place too.
I didn't go to Wuhan, I went to other places in China.
And other places in China. Okay, so you've done quite a bit of traveling and reporting for this book in pre-COVID times, right? You were traveling before the pandemic. And I mean, this is really just my usual kind of jaw-dropped admiration for people who go places and find facts. But when you go to these places, how much do you know about what you're going to find? For example, the chapter on Dhaka, it just seems like it's such a crazy crush of vehicles. There's literally millions of, if not hundreds of millions of rickshawwallas zooming past you at every moment. How did you find the one rickshawwalla you were going to interview and get to know him? How did you find other experts? Sort of like when you land in a place like that, how many guidance points do you already have, and to what extent are you just wandering around looking for people to talk to?
Yeah, so, well, in Bangladesh, I went there cold, didn't know anything, was totally ignorant. I had some contacts there, and some friends and colleagues said, oh, you gotta call this person. But the first thing I did is I got a translator and a fixer, a woman named Esha, who's an incredibly smart young woman who should write her own books. Maybe she is. Actually, I spoke to her not long ago. I don't know that she's writing books. She's kind of like a political activist type. But she helped me because I didn't speak Bengali, and she's a native Dhakaite, and she knew the city like the back of her hand. And she not only knew how to get around, but she knew its soul. So like that's what you do. You basically draw on the expertise of people who know something and can lead you through. In terms of how I found the rickshawwalla, who I kind of the chapter's focused on, is a guy named Badsha, who these rickshaw pullers, as they're called, there may be 1 million of them in Dhaka, maybe even more. Dhaka is so densely populated. There are very few streets in Dhaka. Okay, like far fewer streets than the number that you need to have to make a city manageable, workable, right? So it's kind of a traffic hellscape. I went over there doing double duty, both to research this book and report for the book, but also to write a piece for the New York Times about Dhaka's traffic problems. But in any case, I knew I wanted to talk to a rickshawwalla. I knew I needed to find one rickshawwalla to kind of focus the chapter on. And as I said, there are lots of them, and they're extremely poor, and many of them are very, very young. There's a lot of child labor in Bangladesh. There are rickshaw pullers who are as young as 12 and 13. And the guy I found and wound up spending time with, Badsha, is a lot older than most. He's like my age, which is old.
Well, this is why I'm asking, because he's an unusual figure among the rickshaw wallets, it seems like.
So what I did in terms of like actually, I went to a place where a lot of them hang out in Central Dhaka trying to scare up fares. And I had my fixer translator with me, and we kind of surveyed the scene. And I went on a few rides with a few different people, but Bacha was the guy who was just such a compelling character. So he's extremely charismatic man, and yeah, like most of the rickshaw pullers there, he has very little education. He's illiterate. The only word he can write is his own name, but he's just a whip smart person and incredibly street smart in the way that someone who's lived in Dhaka kind of has to be, and who works at that job has to be. So it was a very heady experience being over there. But yeah, to like circumnavigate like a rickshaw weaving through Dhaka traffic, back to your question, which was had something to do with how the hell it works.
That was in particular, that chapter is so vibrant because it really captures what, like you say, a traffic hellscape that city is, and just how incredibly overpopulated it is for the infrastructure it has. So, the idea that you would just get off a plane there and say, okay, I have 4 days to mine a story from this world.
Yeah, no, I had more than 4 days for one thing, but yeah, it's definitely like you have to find someone who can help you, especially when you don't speak the language. And that's, there's a lot of fixer translators that journalists employ, and they're like the unsung heroes of a lot of foreign reporting. That's my answer. But if you want to go to Bangladesh and report a story, find Esha.
I think I'll just stick with the chapter. All right, so I warned you this question was coming. This is the paths not taken question. So what are some either chapter themes or geographical locations or tidbits of research that you tried to shoehorn into the book and couldn't, or you rejected because they didn't fit? I mean, this is, like I say, it's not a chronological history. It's these kind of overlapping frames of history, and the way that you move between them it's just freewheeling, to use a pipe term, right? So what were some things that you thought might make it in there, but you just weren't able to find a way?
Okay, I can do that. Should I talk about the things that are in there that shouldn't be in there?
That's later
Okay,
conversation.
we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that in private. There's a couple that come to mind. That chapter that I talked about which is called the bicycle window, which is about those creation myths and all these apocryphal stories that circulate about the first bicycle. I kind of reported out a little. There was a story that came over that crossed the wires internationally. That was reported on Wire Services some years back about a guy who was pedaling around Beijing on a wooden bicycle, which he claimed had been invented 5,000 years ago by a famous early Chinese engineer of that period. And there were pictures of him online, and there were just kind of like the basic facts of the story, that he was riding around Beijing trying to promote this as the first bicycle. That was reported, but there was no other information. And I managed to track down the story of this guy and how he came to build this thing and why he did, and it was a hoax, which it's kind of a sad story actually. It was a hoax which this guy perpetrated because he was in debt, and he was hoping to get on TV and make money. But it was actually a really a kind of an amazing and poignant story. And I spoke to all these people who kind of interacted with him during the months. He managed to get a university to fund his building of a replica, one of these machines, and then that was the thing that he pedaled around Beijing in. And that was supposed to be in that chapter, in fact, which is the first chapter of the book after the throat-clearing prologue and introduction. And that was the thing that I originally had starting off the book. And when I turned it in, my editor said, this chapter takes way too many turns. And she was right. So that hit the cutting room floor. And the only other thing, I'll actually tell one other one, which is that because it's practically my favorite chapter, and it didn't make the book at all. But there are these. There was a chapter that was kind of about. It was about these crazy you would like this. These identical twin brothers who were homesteaders who lived in the Mojave Desert, and they were, among other things, they formed what is regarded among the cognoscenti as a very important like outsider art type rockabilly group from the 50s. They also were so amazing looking that they kind of look like the Grant Wood painting American Gothic. Like the two brothers looked like the dude in American Gothic, except they had big walrusian mustaches. And they were extras in a lot of movies, like kind of Hollywood B movies, like The Russians Are Coming, you know what I mean? Anyone know the movie The Russians Are Coming? Jack is nodding. Anyway, Robert's nodding. Anyway, they're in that. But they also invented a bicycle, which they called the revolutionary bicycle, which is a kind of a weird recumbent bicycle, and they left behind a manifesto in the ruins of their home in the Mojave Desert, which popped up in an eBay auction, and I bought it for $100. Not really knowing so much about them, but I was like, this has got to be a good story, and I still have it. It's an amazing artifact.
Why didn't that chapter make it in?
You got to know when to stop writing. Sorry, I don't know, but you got it. Like I had to stop, and I couldn't quite turn the screws on the chapter, so maybe someday that'll be issued as a deep cut for the real Jody Rosen heads out there. Really wants real hard stuff. Yeah.
All right, we're almost out of time because you need to sign. We have like 5 minutes, so I'm going to go to just personal stories for the very end and tell my own couple personal stories about falling off of bikes, because you talk about falling quite a bit. You talk about there's a description of you going riding with Danny McCaskill, who's this Scottish trick rider and famous kind of display stunt cyclist, and he takes you on a mountain bike trail and you completely eat it under the handlebars of your bike, and I can really feel that. I remember my own kind of bone-shaking bike accidents. And in order to be able to ask this question, I actually rode a bike here tonight, even though I'm not a person who cycles around New York, and you write really beautifully about the heady feeling of cycling around the city and the combination of danger and excitement and, the different kind of people watching and perspective on the city than you get in any other vehicle or walking on foot. And that all sounded so exciting, so I was really hoping I could cycle over here. It's about a, 10-minute ride from my apartment, and say, I felt it, and I've seen the light, and now I'm going to cycle around the city, but honestly, it was terrifying. And unless I'm in a protected bike lane, like on Ocean Parkway to Coney Island with curves on both sides, I'm very anxious riding in traffic. But I wanted to just end with that. Can you give some advice to those of us like me who read this book and think, I wish I were a dauntless cyclist who was hopping on my bike and experiencing the city, but honestly, the bike trails randomly end, and it's terrifying, and I'm too scared to do it.
I don't know, I kind of want to throw this one out to the audience.
More pedestrians die than cyclists in New York City.
Okay, that's a good fact. For those of you who didn't hear that, more pedestrians die than cyclists. I don't know, that seems like cold comfort. But okay, here's what I'd say. I'd say.
And I would also just say that Robert, my husband, who's out there in the audience, as you know, had a terrible bike accident when he was doored like almost 20 years ago. And, had brain surgery and had to spend 3 weeks in the hospital.
Don't sit, I'm looking at my wife who's over here.
He had no helmet on, which never happened now.
Get photos?
I'm sorry to throw you out as this grisly statistic, but no, and he still rides bike around the city.
Right.
But having seen that happen, it makes me anxious. And when I see the delivery guys go by and they're all dressed in black and they have no reflector and they have no helmet, I want to be this granny screaming after them and wagging my finger.
Okay, I think I have something to say about this. After all, so here's the thing. It shouldn't be like that, right? Like we need proper infrastructure in the city, like in the world, for bicycles. Like the bicycle is the ideal urban vehicle. It's the best way to get around a city. It's imperative that we reduce the number of cars, for instance, in New York. That has to happen by, among other things, getting rid of parking spaces. Free parking has to go away. Basically, cars need to be banned in city centers across the world. As, for instance, Mayor Anne Hidalgo is doing in Paris right now, that's turning Paris into a new bicycle utopia of a sort.
Have you been there in the new Utopian age?
No. I look forward to it. Can't wait. But, it's dangerous. It's also super dangerous to be in a car. You know what I mean? More people die in auto accidents. In the century plus that the statistics have been kept, more people have perished in automobile accidents in this country than the combined number of people who've died in all of the wars. You know, it's insane that there are cars, right? I mean, obviously we need cars, but in cities we should have far fewer cars. So everything. So it's not that like, yes, riding bicycles is scary, but I think the more cyclists we have out there, the better it is for all people, and also the better it is for like the planet and for your children's future, because, you know, like I said, there's a lot of like high-flown rhetoric about like the bicycle as like the redemptive green machine that's going to save the world, and a lot of that is, there's some BS there, but it also is, a lot of it is true. Like the city a bicycle city is a saner, safer, cleaner, happier place to be. So that's number one. But the other thing is just like, I mean, I'm not gonna lie, and I'm like, there are members of my family here right now who I sort of worry about saying this because I think they're gonna think that I should bike, I should not bike around. But the truth is, there is like a kind of, there is also a secret thrill, and I think people who bike in the city know this, a kind of like a macho thrill, or of being on a bike and, I don't know, surviving. You know what I mean? You're threading the traffic. You know what I mean? You really feel alive when you're on a bike in the city, and you really experience the city and it's like in all its magnificence and volatility and freakiness. So if you really want to live, you should cultivate this new biking habit.
I think the answer is a little bit like what your dentist says when they tell you to floss more. It's like, if it hurts, that means you need to do more of it. You know, I mean, honestly, it's true. If there were more of a critical mass of people out on bikes, they would be a safer place to be. But that doesn't put more lanes on the streets.
Yeah.
All right, we need to break. Do you want to throw a question out first?
So how are we doing on time? Do we need to like wrap it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we're
I mean, everybody here knows each other, so we can talk amongst ourselves or like whatever. Thanks for coming, guys. I really appreciate it.
Again, actually, we have now one last copy of Two Wheels Good available for purchase, so act fast. We also have copies of Cameraman available. We do ask that once you get your book signed, that you please exit in a timely manner so that our staff can start to reorganize the store. Thank you all so much for coming out. If you miss your chance to buy a copy, you can buy one online as well, or stop by the store in a few days. All right, thank you all so much for coming out.